presentation by Professor Gary Pies. He is now emeritus, but he used to teach in the history department and sociology. He's going to give us the differential application of justice, as we are fully aware of what's going on today. And there is pretty much, it's a common sense for us to recognize that there is some a differential treatment about different racial groups and ethnic groups in the United States. I wonder, I believe other countries as well, but it is much more so in the United States. So Professor Kais is going to talk about the differential application of justice and the law concerning African Americans and whites. So I would like to introduce Professor Kais. After graduating from UC Santa Barbara and earning a master's degree, Gary taught at PCC, GCC, and Crescenta Valley High School. Everything from fundamentals U.S. history to first-year college U.S. history and sociology. In his 48-year career, he was voted Teacher of the Year, wow, by the local Lions Club, the Teacher of the Year at Crescenta Valley High School twice, and the Educator of the Year by the Montrose Verdugo City Chamber of Commerce. Gary has also been listed in Who's Who of American Teachers. Continuing to teach at GCC after retirement, he co-authored 2 books, just to mention, The Murder and Mayhem in Crescenta Valley and Wicked Crescenta Valley. These books are based on local history, books dealing with sinister and scandalous and murderous history of the Crescenta Valley. So these books are just a perfect timing for our trick-or-treat day. So here goes. I would like to introduce Professor Gary Pies. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. I wasn't going to bring any copies of my book, but Dr. Moore insisted, so I did. You are not required to buy anything, but I do have a few copies, and they're available on Amazon.com also. Also, Flint Ridge La Cuneta bookstore carries them, and Once Upon a Time in Montrose. I do not normally wear a sweatshirt when I'm presenting a paper, but I thought this one was appropriate for today because it commemorates one of the most important events in the civil rights movement. The integration of Little Rock, Arkansas High School. My daughter bought this for me, and she's something of an expert on the subject of the civil rights movement also. Before I get going, I want to make a few points to emphasize. When Dr. Moore asked me to do this presentation...
Gary, I want to just to make a correction. I'm a dropout.
Pardon?
PhD.
Pardon?
I'm a dropout.
Oh, pardon me. I'm sorry.
So I just want to correct it.
Well, I have to make a correction too, because I wrote the 2 books with Mike Lawler, who was a former student of mine, and I wanted to make sure he got credit too. When I was asked to do this paper, I was asked in a meeting just like this, and I rambled off something on the top of my head without thinking about it a great deal. And then later on, as I was writing the paper, I had some different ideas about how it should be presented. And I thought about what it means to be black. And then I realized I couldn't do that because I'm not black. So how about what it means to be white? It's a mirror image of the same problem. I thought about haves and have-nots, privilege, protection, advantage, and eventually I came back to differential application of justice and the law. One of the things to keep in mind here, I think it is really essential to keep in mind, Felix Frankfurter was one of the great justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. One afternoon he was talking to a friend on the street, and he looked at his watch and he said, "I have to go, the court is about to go into session." And his friend, as he walked away, said, "Go and do justice." And Frankfurter came back to him and said, "That's not my job. My job is to interpret the law. Justice and the law are not the same thing." So as I go through this, I think it's a very important point to keep in mind. Justice and the law are not always the same thing. There's two other little points here. One in regard to figures. You may hear me give a couple of figures that will be different than others because it comes from all sorts of sources. And sometimes we can't even agree. On a subject of this importance, we don't have agreement on the basic facts. I've been writing this for over 2 years now, thinking about this subject. And as I did, I rewrote passages and passages, and last night, before I closed up, I was rewriting a couple of paragraphs. And then this morning, I added more material to this. The things are changing all the time. One figure I think is very important that I'll emphasize is that we have 2 million people in jail in this country. That figure I've seen over and over and over again. The last figure I saw said 1.5 million. How can our figures be off 600,000 people? We have to come to some understanding of what the basic facts are. And again, before I really get started, one last thing I would like to say on this. There's a lot of debate, and it's been going on since President Obama got elected, that we're in a post-racial America. Post-racial America. Just recently at UCLA, a fraternity was cited for doing a blackface performance at the school. UC Davis just had swastikas painted on some of its buildings. And USC, their student body president, was called an Indian piece of shit by a fraternity member. These are our most brilliant students. You have to be in the top 9% to get into UCLA and UC Davis. Education is no barrier to ignorance, stupidity, and bigotry. In late 1994, James Darby, a 9-year-old African American, wrote a letter to President Bill Clinton. He wrote, "Dear Mr. Clinton, I want you to stop the killing in the city. People is dead, and I think that somebody might kill me. So would you please stop the people from deading? I'm asking you nicely to stop it. I know you can do it. Do it. I know you could. Your friend, James." 10 days later, James was at a picnic, family picnic, on Mother's Day, when 19-year-old Joseph Norfleet rolled up with a shotgun and blew his head off. 2 of his uncles were wounded by James' skull fragments. Every hour, someone in this country commits a hate crime. At least 8 blacks, 3 whites, 3 gays, 3 Jews, and 1 Latino face hate crimes every day. Since 1980, more than 260,000 African American men have been killed in America. This is an average of 7,400 a year, 616 a month, 11 a week. The latest figure is 1 black male killed by police every 9 days in this country. These figures are astounding, at least to me. Incredible. Unbelievable. Outrageous. I don't know how many of you have felt sick to your stomach for something you saw, heard, or read. I don't remember having that feeling until I was 51 years old. That feeling came to me several times during the preparing this presentation. Everything is not negative. Everything is not negative. There are hopeful signs. Black Lives Matter. Racial discrimination has lessened in the United States. Racial inequality has not. African Americans have higher levels of poverty, incarceration, unemployment. Prejudice and bigotry are in retreat. But, this is a quote, "I think we're a long way from having anything to celebrate," says social psychologist Philip Goff. Black Lives Matter, we would like to create a country in which Black lives matter as much as white lives, in the terms of physical safety, education, health, job opportunities, criminal prosecution, and political power. That is a quote from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Americans believe in equality of opportunity and equal justice under the law. 95% of Americans agree that everyone should have an equal opportunity to should have equal opportunity to get ahead. 86% of Americans believe society should do whatever it takes to make that possible. What makes the U.S. so attractive to immigrants is our political stability, our dedication to equal opportunity. What holds America together is our diversity, tolerance for cultural, religious, social, and political diversity. Americans like to believe that America's story is one of struggle against intolerance, against oppression, against xenophobia, against the forces that have prohibited people from participating in the larger life of the community. Instead, we have an America built on the exploitation of African Americans, a system that only could be justified by a belief in racial inferiority. This condemnation of African Americans began with 250 years of slavery, followed by 150 years of discrimination, segregation, racist housing policies, police oppression, terrorism, lack of jobs, and poor education. When the property of the middle class was built in the 1940s and 1950s, African Americans were excluded from Social Security. They were excluded from Social Security because domestics and farm workers were not included in Social Security, and 60% of African Americans worked as domestics or farm laborers. They were excluded from the educational benefits of the GI Bill after World War II. The way they were excluded there, and this one always amazes me at how clever racists can be. Racists in the South insisted that the educational benefits of the GI Bill be controlled by the states, administered by the states. Then they passed regulations that the money could only be used at white colleges. 98% of the money distributed under the GI Bill for housing loans went to white people. How can we claim equal opportunity while whites have owned property for decades and pass that wealth on to their children? How do African Americans stack up against the majority population? 95% of senior management jobs are held by white men. The average white person's wealth is at least 10 times and maybe as high as 20 times that of the African American family. Every dollar a white man makes, an African American male makes 74 cents. An African American woman, 64 cents. 67% of African American families make less than the national average wealth. Since 2008, white families' income has increased 8%. People of color, their wealth has decreased by 11%. Children born in poverty areas of Los Angeles and the rest of the United States have a life expectancy 10 years less than the national average. I give you these figures because I was shocked when I saw the Fox News program, the Fox News special, how hard it is to be white in America. And the audacity of Fox News to do something like that. This country has been resegregating its schools for years. 40% of African American and Latino students go to schools that are 90 to 100% students of color. For the first time in the history of the country, the public school average student is below income level, in the lower income levels. And as a result, rich people are abandoning the public schools. 9% of the students of Los Angeles go to private schools. Some of them charge up to $39,000 a year for an elementary school education. Teachers in schools, the highest percentage of African American Latinos are paid $2,000 a year less. Also, schools that have high populations of Latino and African Americans are 4 times as likely to have 80% of their faculty certificated, meaning you have 20% faculty that is not certificated, not qualified to be teaching. Give you one other figure in regard to that. Chicago is 1/3 white. Chicago is 1/3 white. 90% of the students in the Chicago school system are African American. Blacks are denied housing between 35 and 75% of the time. That is illegal under federal law. They're given poor seating in restaurants. 70% of blacks report at least one major discrimination in their lifetime. In restaurants, they get poor service, special requirements. They are surveilled. They are assigned to the least obvious place in the restaurant. And if you don't believe what I'm saying here about how African Americans are treated here in Glendale, get one of your African American friends and start going to the restaurants at 6 o'clock and see where you're seated in this city. See, one of the things that's interesting is that discrimination and overt racism has declined, but that has not taken advantage or taken awareness of what is called implicit racism, which I may mention. I'm not sure I'll have time for that. One area, as I said, this is a huge topic, and I can't cover it all. And I was going to do a major section on police shootings. I don't know that I will have any time for that. But one area that I basically did drop for the most part was in regard to health consequences. But I do want to make one remark in regard to the difference of health and how health is handled in this country. Houston, Texas is 25% African American. 75% of all municipal garbage incinerators are in African American areas. 100% of garbage dumps in Houston are in African American areas. The EPA fines polluters in white populations 500% more than they fine polluters in minority areas. 71% of African Americans and 50% of Latinos live in toxic waste site areas. That gives you some idea why the health factor and the life expectancy is not as high as it should be. As it should be. One of the things you'll find out here, at least I hope you will, is that participation in the political process is important. If you don't have a vote and you don't use the vote, you cannot control your own living space. That's what happens in Houston. When people don't vote, they wind up with all the garbage put in their neighborhoods. There's another book, Savage Inequalities. I recommend it highly to you. Savage Inequalities, the author points out that in New York, there is not one dump or garbage reclamation center in Manhattan. They're all in the other areas. Manhattan is the richest area of New York City. You know, we're talking about equality. African Americans start the race for life with lead weights on their feet. Or as Stephen Colbert says, we're lucky here in America. We live in a free market society. Think of it as a ladder. No matter what rung you're born on, you have the exact same opportunity as everyone else to get to the top. Sure, you might say that some folks have less distance to climb than others, or that many of the lower rungs are slippery because they're covered with garbage, and your high school didn't have an AP ladder climbing class, and the rung right above you is out of order, and the guy who the landlord keeps saying he's going to fix it but never does. And there's a guy that hangs out on the corner of your rung who's always trying to get you high. And you're wondering if maybe you could get a little help up the ladder. United States Senator from New York, member of the Nixon administration, sociologist, wrote a book in 1965 in which he said, the Negro family has faced 300 years of unimaginable mistreatment. The racist virus in the country has poisoned the bloodstream. That the American Negro has survived at all is extraordinary. A lesser people might simply have died out, as indeed others have. But it may not be supposed that the Negro American community has not paid a fearful price for the incredible mistreatment to which it has been subjected over 300 centuries. You know, when an affluent child stumbles, there's a parent or someone else to jump in to offer help. They get you a lawyer. They get you therapy. They get you a tutor. If you want to see how the privileged protect their own, you should see the movie W on George Bush. Whiteness is the visible uniform of the dominant racial group. Those defined as white receive systemic privileges. This is why groups not yet white strive to identify with white groups. If you don't understand that little phrase, that not white yet, Irish Americans weren't white at one time. They had to struggle for equality. Today, some of our Asian communities are defined as white in that privileged class. James Brule says part of the problem is the white society's failure to see what is going on. This is from PBS show, Whiteness Project. It covered the subject of race from a white perspective. Don't Don't buy into that nonsense about discrimination. Are you tired of being pushed around? African Americans are always telling you why you owe them something. 75% of whites have all white social networks. Only 16% of whites believe African Americans face significant discrimination. Many whites claim that there is greater anti-white discrimination, and they don't see any racism in the country. The elite live in a bubble of privilege. They live in that privilege by denying it exists, calling it something else, directing attention elsewhere, divide and conquer. Most importantly, the elite blames the problems of the poor on the poor. And we as Americans, because we believe in social mobility and the ability to achieve a higher stature of life, generally accept that view. The poor are incompetent, they're lazy and shiftless, and the real tragedy of that particular statement is the poor believe it of themselves. Where do the rich in this country come from? Today, 9% of the rich in this country started out in the lower class. 20% came from the middle class, 68% from the upper class. If you want to be wealthy and enjoy a high quality of life, pick your parents wisely. 93% of the very rich in this country inherited their wealth. You know, the threat of racism is a threat to the survival of America. Perhaps the most urgent question may be how we live together in a relentlessly diversifying America. I'm going to get into some other areas here now, and talking about this in maybe a little more statistical framework. African Americans are disproportionately charged with crimes, particularly serious crimes. They are underrepresented on juries and sentenced to death at much higher rates than whites. In one study of speeding, there were 2,090 people stopped for traffic violations, and 98% of them were for speeding. African Americans were 35% of those stopped, while only 15% of the population. African Americans are stopped 5 times, at least 5 times as often as whites. ABC News just recently had a figure that there were 75% more likely to be stopped than whites. They are 6.5 times as likely as whites to be arrested. In Maryland, there was a stop and search of 1,000 people. And they're stopping and searching 1,000 people. 713 of them were African American. Half of African Americans will have been arrested by age 23. African Americans are 13% of the population, but along with Latinos, make up 61% of the prison population of the United States. 1 in 35 African Americans is in prison. 1 in 3 will be arrested. Conviction of a felony, you lose your right to vote. 500,000 African Americans have lost their right to vote. The importance of that, in 2000, Jeb Bush, as governor of the state of Florida, disenfranchised 60,000 African Americans. 60,000 African Americans denied their vote in Florida. George Bush won the presidency with 600 votes in Florida. African Americans vote 90% Democratic. Who would have been president in 2001? Losing the vote means, well, I'll come back to that point. Leading cause of death of young African Americans, homicide. What are you going to be when you grow up? Well, if I grow up, because you may not. 2/3 of African American teens can expect to die before 65 years of age. They are less likely to reach 45 years of age. And one of the things you can see, and this is minority communities and gang violence, you can drive down to East LA and South LA today and drive the streets and see people sitting in wheelchairs, young men. In some ways, they're the unlucky ones because their friends are dead. You know, if you figure you're going to be dead by 25 years of age, what's the point of earning a skill? What's the point of going to college? There is no future to plan for. You may as well enjoy what you have now to the best of your ability. Blacks, as I said, are 13% of the population. However, they constitute 26% of those arrested, 32% of those referred to the courts, 36% of those charged with crimes, and 46% of those imprisoned. African Americans and Latinos are 25% of the population, but as I said, they're 61% of the prison population. Blacks who kill whites are 7 times as likely to be sentenced to death than whites who kill blacks. In 1997, 82% of those convicted of killing a white man was sentenced to death. 12% of whites convicted of killing a black were sentenced to death. The area that I'm not going to get to at all, and I'm only going to go for about another 10 minutes here so that you can ask some questions. But one of the areas that I am not covering, and I just would mention it, is the impact of the imprisonment of such a large percentage of our minority population on their families. Kids, what happens to them? I'm also not mentioning anything here in regard to women. We should be aware that we look at the figures of African American males who are killed. African American women are also killed by the police. The latest, Sandy Blanning in Texas. The United States is 5% of the world population. We have 25% of the prison population. 25%. To give you some idea of what that means, China, with 1.3 billion people versus our approximately 320 million, China has 500,000 people less in prison than the United States. We have become the incarceration nation. We lock up everybody for the slightest violation of the law. There is hope in this area. The federal government is currently releasing 6,000 low-risk offenders, mainly for drug arrest. That is just the start. We can't afford to lock everybody up. Right now, California spends $30 billion a year on our prison system. We spend $27 billion on the University of California. $80 billion a year is the figure. Minimal figure for keeping a person in prison is $45,000 a year. Minimal. Why don't we start spending $23,000 to make sure these people can get a decent job? You know, I've been using a figure. It was mentioned that I've been in this racket for 48 years. One of the figures that I learned in college, and I never could believe it, is that the average prisoner in the state of California has a 6th grade education. But I just came across a new figure while doing this paper. 50% of our prison population is functionally illiterate. You know, that 6th grade education may be too high. You're functionally illiterate, you're not going to learn a skill. You're not going to get a decent job. What else are you going to do to survive? You have to live by your wits and whatever other means you can achieve. The reason we have so many people in jail in this country is starting in 1970, when we had a prison population of 300,000. Now, in 1970, I'm trying to think of what the population of the country had been, maybe only 200 million. Maybe only 200 million, with 300,000 in jail. We declared war on crime. We lengthened prison sentences. We also declared war on drugs and started locking people up for drug violations. At the same time we did that, we cut our social safety net. We cut money for social programs, welfare, education, food stamps, job training. You know, our prisons originally were called penitentiaries. The idea of penitentiaries is that you were in prison doing penance for your sins, and you would be redeemed when you got out. Then we changed the term to rehabilitation. Someplace in the 70s we gave up on rehabilitation and decided to punish prisoners, make life as miserable as we could for them so that nobody would ever want to go back. Nobody ever wants to go to prison. They didn't want to go in the first place. So you're going to make it so painful they won't come back. Most of them come back. One of the things to keep in mind, this is an example I've used a long time, and I hope it'll make sense to you. You walk home from school or your job every day, and you go through the zoo, go through the LA Zoo. And when you enter the zoo, on the left is a lion in a cage, and on the right there's a lion in the cage. The lion on the left, you throw 5 pounds of hamburger to every day. The one on the right, you take a stick and beat on his bars and make his life miserable, scream at him, yell at him. And one day you walk into that zoo, and one of those cages is open. Which one do you want to be open? See, they get out someday. They get out someday, and if you've made them bitter and angry and filled with vengeance, what do you expect? Now, again, I can't get into this particular point, but a lot of you have dealt with conditioning, and the author of Conditioning, who I'm forgetting his name right now, wrote Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and what he said at that time is, if you take a society and you put good things in it, education and adequate food and recreation, you will get those things out of it. If you put violence and hunger and lack of employment, you get those things out of it. So if you're punishing prisoners, what can you expect as a society? Of those approximately 2 million people in prison, 1 million of them are African Americans. African Americans are 6 to 7 times as likely to go to jail. Paul Butler, professor of Georgetown University Law Center, calls this mass incarceration is racist. Sociologist David Garland calls this mass imprisonment. Locke Wannick calls this is a new chapter in racial oppression. Since 1980, millions of African Americans have gone to prison. They have been kept from work, family, education, the vote. 1 in 4 African Americans will wind up in prison before they're 30. High school dropouts, 70% will wind up in prison. You know, it has gotten so bad that some people feel, yes, okay, we're going to go to high school until we drop out or we graduate, and then we're going to jail. Going to jail. African American unemployment is about 34%. In the last 15 years, police have arrested 107 million people for marijuana possession. It's an average of 700,000 a year. Blacks are arrested at 6 times the rate of whites, though they use marijuana in the same percentage as whites. Whites, as I said, same percentages, but 90% of pot arrests are for African Americans. As I said, I needed to leave some time for you to ask a question or two, but a drug conviction keeps you from getting student loans, educational grants, work-study programs, housing, food stamps, welfare. You can't work as a security guard. You cannot work as a nursing home aide. Any work with children. 800 jobs are denied to convicted felons. One of the areas you could check on, because I know this to be true, janitors in the Glendale Unified School District. They cannot have a felony on their record, but the district hires felons because they pay so little, they're the only ones who will work as janitors in this community. 65 million Americans have a criminal record.